Stop for a moment and picture a Viking. What do you see? You see a giant man with a red beard. He's holding a Dane axe. He's jumping out of a longship onto an English beach, screaming, ready to burn a monastery. He is a brute, a force of nature, a singular, terrifying entity known as the Northman. This image is the greatest lie of the Middle Ages. It is a lie told by terrified monks and perpetuated by Hollywood. It simplifies a complex, fractured, and deeply divided world into a single cartoon villain. The truth is that there was no such thing as the Vikings as a unified people. If you traveled back to the year 900 AD and called a man from Norway a Viking, he wouldn't know what you were talking about. Viking was a verb. It was something you did. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition. It was a job description, not a nationality. These men did not see themselves as one people. A warrior from the deep fjords of Western Norway had about as much in common with a merchant from the plains of Sweden as a cowboy from Texas has with a banker from Wall Street. They spoke different dialects of Old Norse. They worshipped different aspects of the gods. They had different laws, different kings, and, most importantly, they hated each other almost as much as they hated the Christians. For 300 years, these three distinct nations, Sweden and Denmark, competed for land, silver, and glory. They fought entirely different wars against entirely different enemies. The Danes went south and west. They were the army. The conquerors who broke England and France. The Swedes went east. They were the merchants and guards who traveled the rivers of Rushar to the gates of Baghdad and Constantinople. The Norwegians went north and west. They were the explorers, the sea wolves who pushed the known world off the edge of the map, discovering Iceland, Greenland, and America. And then there is the fourth player, the silent ghost in the corner of the room, Finland, the land of wizards. Feared by the Norsemen themselves, a people who were definitely not Vikings, but who were deadlier in their own way. To understand the Viking Age, to truly understand who these people were and why they exploded out of the north with such violence, we must stop treating them as a monolith. We must look at the map. Geography is destiny. The land shapes the people. A man born on a rocky, windswept island in Norway will not look at the world the same way as a man born on the fertile flatlands of Denmark. The soil dictates the culture. The sea dictates the ambition. This documentary is not just a story of battles. It is a forensic investigation into the soul of Scandinavia. We are going to dissect the differences between these three nations, culturally, politically, and militarily. We will look at their ships, their weapons, their tactics, and their ultimate goals. We will finally answer the question that historians argue about to this day. Which of them was truly the deadliest? Who brought home the most gold? Who conquered the most land? And who left the deepest scar on the face of the world? Welcome to the real history of the North. Welcome to the civil war that changed Europe. Asterisk to begin. We must look at the stage where this drama played out. Scandinavia is not a single landmass. It is a massive, complex region defined by its relationship with the water. Let's look at Denmark first. Denmark in the Viking Age was not just the peninsula of Jutland we see today. It included southern Sweden, Scania, and parts of northern Germany. But the key feature of Denmark is that it is flat. It has fertile soil. It is relatively easy to travel across. This geography meant that Denmark could support a larger population. It meant farmers could grow surplus food. Surplus food means you can support kings. It means you can build armies. Denmark was destined to be the center of political power. Now, look at Norway. Norway is a geographical nightmare. It is a thin strip of mountainous coastline batting against the savage North Atlantic. There is almost no arable land. You cannot farm a mountain. The people lived in isolated fjords, cut off from each other by high peaks and deep water. The only highway was the sea. If a Norwegian wanted anything, food, wealth, a wife, he had to get in a boat. Norway was destined to produce the world's greatest individual sailors. Finally, look at Sweden. Sweden is a land of deep forests and massive lakes, facing east toward the Baltic Sea, while Denmark looked toward the rich lands of England and France. Sweden looked toward the vast, mysterious river systems of Russia. Their destiny lay not in the open ocean, but on the river roads that led to the Silk Road and the riches of the Caliphate. 3 lands, 3 destinies, and 3 very different ways of waging war. Let's begin with the men who had the hardest land, and therefore the hardest souls. The Norwegians. To understand the Norwegian Viking, you must first understand the rock. The geography of Norway is not just a backdrop. It is a hammer that forged the character of its people. Unlike the rolling green fields of Denmark or the flat woodlands of Sweden, Norway is a vertical fortress. It is a land of granite walls rising 3,000 feet straight out of the cold black water. It is a place where winter lasts for 7 months, where the sun disappears, and where the valleys are so narrow that neighbors might live only a few miles apart, but never see each other because a mountain range stands in between. In this environment, agriculture was not a career. It was a desperate struggle. There was simply no room. A family might own a tiny patch of dirt at the bottom of a cliff, enough to feed a few goats and grow some barley, but that was it. If you had 3 sons, the farm could not support them all. The eldest son inherited the land. The other 2 had a choice. They could become servants, they could starve, or they could look at the one thing Norway had in abundance. The sea. For the Norwegians, the North Sea was not a barrier. It was a highway. It was the only road they had. This geographical pressure created a specific type of man. The Norwegian Viking was not a soldier marching in a regiment. He was a survivor. He was an individualist. He was a man who was used to relying on himself and his small crew against the raw fury of nature. When they went Viking, they didn't go as an invading army. They went as wolf packs. The primary motivation for the Norwegian expansion wasn't just greed. It was freedom. In the late 9th century, a king named Harald Fairhair began a brutal campaign to unify Norway under a single crown. He wanted to be like Charlemagne. He wanted taxes. He wanted submission. But the fiercely independent chieftains of the fjords despised the idea of bowing to a master. They were men who believed in the ancient rights of the free landowner. So, rather than submit to Harald's tyranny, they packed their ships, took their families, their cattle, and their slaves, and they left. They looked west. The Norwegians were the undisputed masters of the open ocean, while the Danes and Swedes preferred the coastal waters and river systems. The Norwegians pointed their prows directly into the grey void of the North Atlantic. They possessed a navigational instinct that borders on the supernatural, reading the swell of the waves, the flight of birds, and the color of the water to find land that no one knew existed. Their first targets were the islands. To the north of Britain, Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides. They didn't just raid these places, they completely absorbed them. They wiped out the indigenous Pictish populations or intermarried with them, turning these islands into pirate bases. From there, they launched raids into Scotland and Ireland. The Norwegian impact on Ireland was profound. They founded the city of Dublin, which began its life not as a capital, but as a massive slave market, the largest in Western Europe. The Norwegian Vikings here were brutal pragmatists. They realized that fighting the Irish kings was messy, so they often became mercenaries, fighting for one Irish king against another, taking payment in land and silver. They became the Ostmen, a hybrid culture of Norse and Gael that would eventually produce the terrifying Galaglass warriors of the later Middle Ages. But the true genius of the Norwegian Vikings was not in conquest, but in colonization. They were the greatest explorers of the age. When they realized the best land in Europe was taken, they decided to find new land. In 874 AD, they found Iceland. Imagine the allure of it. A massive island full of fish and birds, with no kings, no taxes, and no armies. It was a libertarian paradise. Thousands of Norwegians flocked there, establishing a society based not on feudalism, but on a form of parliamentary democracy called the Althing. This tells us something crucial about the Norwegian soul. They were rebels. They would rather sail into the unknown and live on a rock in the middle of the ocean than kneel before a king they didn't respect. But Iceland wasn't enough. The hunger for the horizon drove them further. A man named Eric the Red, exiled from Norway for murder and then exiled from Iceland for another murder, pushed west again. He found Greenland. He marketed it with a deceptive name to attract settlers, and incredibly, they built a thriving community on the edge of the inhabitable world. And then, the ultimate feat, around the year 1000, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, did the impossible. He sailed a ship without a compass, without a sextant, through the most dangerous waters on Earth, and landed in North America. He called it Vinland. We have to pause and appreciate the magnitude of this. 500 years before Columbus, Norwegian Vikings were cutting timber in Canada. They built a settlement at Lonso Meadows. They encountered the Native Americans, whom they called However, this is where the Norwegian story hits its limit. They were explorers, but they were not empire builders. The settlement in America failed. Why? Because there weren't enough of them. Norway had a small population. They couldn't sustain a colony thousands of miles from home against a hostile indigenous population that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. They retreated. So how do we classify the Norwegian Viking? If the Viking Age were a modern military operation, the Norwegians would be the special forces. They were the Navy SEALs. They operated in small, highly skilled teams. They struck targets that were considered unreachable. They survived in environments that would kill anyone else. They were not driven by the desire to rule nations, but by the desire to own their own destiny. They were the deadliest sailors the world had ever seen. They proved that a wooden ship could conquer the Atlantic. But while they were busy finding empty lands at the edge of the world, their cousins to the east were busy building a very different kind of empire. The Swedes were turning their backs on the ocean and looking toward the rivers. And what they found there would change the course of history even more than the discovery of America. Asterisk. If the Norwegians were the explorers who stared into the void of the Atlantic, the Swedes were the adventurers who stared into the dark heart of the continent. Their destiny was not written on the open ocean. but in the labyrinth of rivers that snaked their way through the endless forests of Eastern Europe, while their cousins to the west were burning monasteries in England for a few gold chalices. The Swedes were chasing a prize so vast it makes the Western raids look like petty theft. They were chasing the Silk Road. The geography of Sweden is defined by the Baltic Sea. It is a calmer body of water than the North Sea, protected from the Atlantic swells. But to the east of Sweden lay a land of mystery. Today we call it Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. In the 9th century, it was a wild, untamed frontier inhabited by Slavic tribes, Finnic peoples, and terrifying nomadic horse archers like the Pechenegs and Khazars. The Swedish Vikings looked at this vast map and saw opportunity. They saw that the great rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Don were not just water. They were highways. If you could navigate them, if you could survive the journey, these rivers would take you all the way to the richest cities on earth, Baghdad and Constantinople. But this journey required a different kind of Viking. A Norwegian sailor had to battle the waves, but a Swedish Russ, as they came to be called, had to battle the land itself. The river systems of Russia were not continuous. There were rapids that could smash a ship to splinters. There were waterfalls that were impassable. To get past them, the Swedes had to perform back-breaking feats of engineering and endurance known as portage. Imagine a crew of 50 men. They reach a waterfall. They have to unload their cargo furs, wax, honey, and heavy chests of silver. Then they have to physically drag their longship out of the water, put it on log rollers, and haul it through the dense forest for miles, uphill, through mud and snow. And they had to do this while wearing their armor, because the woods were full of hostile tribes waiting to ambush them. This created a warrior who was physically immensely powerful, disciplined, and used to working as a unified machine. These men were known as the Russ. The etymology is debated, but most historians agree it comes from the Old Norse word for men who row. And from the word Russ, we get the name Russia. This is the scale of the Swedish impact. They didn't just raid a country. They gave their name to a superpower. The Swedes did not operate like the Norwegian lone wolves. They operated like an armed corporation. They established fortified trading posts along the rivers Novgorod and Kiev. These were not just markets. They were military garrisons. The local Slavic tribes, disorganized and warring among themselves, eventually invited the Rus to police them. The Primary Chronicle, an ancient Russian text, famously quotes the Slavs, saying to the Vikings, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." Whether they were invited or whether they forced their way in, the result was the same. The Swedish Vikings became the aristocracy of Eastern Europe. They established the Rurikid dynasty, a Viking bloodline that would rule Russia for 700 years, all the way until the time of Ivan the Terrible. But the Swedes were not just rulers. They were merchants of the highest order, and their primary commodity was human beings. The Swedes ran the most extensive slave trade of the Viking Age. They would raid the Slavic villages, capture the population, and transport them down the Volga River to the markets of the Islamic Caliphate. The very word slave in the English language comes from Slav, because so many Slavic people were sold by the Vikings in exchange for these slaves and for furs. They wanted one thing: silver, Islamic dirhams. While the Vikings in England were fighting for land, the Swedes were drowning in silver. Archaeologists in Sweden have found hoards containing tens of thousands of Arabic coins. They were connecting the freezing north with the burning sands of the Middle East. This connection brings us to one of the most famous descriptions of Vikings in history. In 922 AD, an Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan met a group of Swedish Rus on the Volga River. His account gives us a chilling picture of these men. He described them as perfect physical specimens, tall as palm trees, blonde and ruddy. He noted that every man carried an axe, a sword, and a knife at all times. But he also described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, men who never washed, who covered their bodies in dark green tattoos from their fingernails to their necks, and who engaged in brutal, drunken rituals. Ibn Fadlan witnessed a ship burial of a Rus chieftain. He watched in horror as the Swedes drugged a slave girl, had her ritualistically raped by every man in the camp, and then sacrificed her by the angel of death, an old crone who stabbed her while two men strangled her with a rope. This account reminds us that the Swedes were not just businessmen. They were members of a cult of violence that shocked even the hardened travelers of the Arab world. Their ambition didn't stop at Baghdad. The river road also led to Miklagard, the great city Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. When the Swedes first saw Constantinople, with its massive triple walls and golden domes, they tried to sack it. They failed. The Byzantines had Greek fire, a flamethrower weapon that burned their ships on the water. But the Swedes were if they couldn't conquer the city, they would work for it. This led to the creation of the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine emperors. Trusting no one, hired these massive Swedish warriors as their personal bodyguards. They were paid their weight in gold. They were given the finest armor in the world. They were the elite shock troops of the medieval Mediterranean. A Swedish Viking could leave his farm in row down the rivers of Russia, fight in the deserts of Syria, stand guard in the throne room of a Roman emperor, and return home a millionaire. So were the Swedes, the deadliest. If you measure deadliness by the reach of their influence, the answer is yes. They spanned 2 continents. They founded the Russian state. They protected the Roman Empire. They linked the Vikings to the Silk Road. They were the lords of the East, a hybrid of merchant kings and ruthless killers who proved that if you control the rivers, you control the world. But while the Swedes were building a commercial empire in the East, the Danes were preparing to unleash something far more direct upon the West: total war. Asterisk, if Norway created the explorer and Sweden created the merchant, Denmark created the soldier. To understand the Danish Viking, you must look down at the ground. You must look at the soil. While the Norwegians were scraping a living from granite cliffs and the Swedes were hacking through dense pine forests, the Danes were walking on gold. The Jutland Peninsula is an extension of the European plain. It is flat, it is green, it is fertile. In the Middle Ages, geography like this meant only one thing: demographics. Because the Danes could grow more grain, they could feed more babies. Because they could feed more babies, they had a massive population surplus compared to their northern neighbors. And because the terrain was flat, communication was easy. A king in Jelling could send a rider to the coast in a day. This allowed for the centralization of power much earlier than in Norway or Sweden. Denmark was not a collection of isolated tribes. It was the first true superpower of the North. But there was another factor that hardened the Danish soul. They shared a border with the Holy Roman Empire. Just to the south lay the Franks, the mightiest Christian military machine on earth. For centuries, the Danes stared across that border, watching the Franks crush the Saxons, force convert pagans, and expand their borders. This proximity to a superpower forced the Danes to evolve. You cannot be a disorganized rabble when Charlemagne is knocking at your door. You must become an army. This is why the Danes were the kings of war. They were not interested in finding empty islands in the Atlantic. They were not interested in portaging boats through Russian swamps. They were interested in conquest. They looked west, across the narrow stretch of the North Sea, at the fractured, wealthy kingdoms of England and the fat, fertile lands of Francia. They didn't just want to raid these places. They wanted to own them. The Danish style of warfare was distinct. It was defined by scale and organization. While a Norwegian raid might involve 3 ships and 100 men hitting a monastery and vanishing, a Danish campaign involved fleets of 300 ships and armies of 5,000 men. They introduced a level of military discipline that the Anglo-Saxons were terrifyingly unprepared for. The turning point in history came in 865 AD. This is the year the Viking Age changed from a nuisance to an existential threat. A force landed in East Anglia that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply called the Missile Hein here the Great Heathen Army. Note the word army. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a coalition of Danish kings and warlords, united under the banner of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrokmost, notably Ivar the Boneless Dot. Ivar is the perfect avatar for the Danish war machine. He was a tactician. He didn't just run at the enemy screaming. He used terrain. He used spies. He used psychological warfare. Under his command, the Danes didn't just burn villages. They dismantled kingdoms. They systematically destroyed the ancient Anglo-Saxon First, Northumbria fell, then East Anglia, then Mercia. They captured kings and executed them in rituals of horrific brutality. King Alelo was subjected to the blood eagle. King Edmund was riddled with arrows like Saint Sebastian. But the Danes didn't just kill. They stayed. This is the crucial difference. The Norwegian took his loot back to the fjord. The Dane used his loot to build a fortress. They established the Danelaw, massive swath of England where Danish law, not English law, prevailed. They fortified towns like York, Jorvik, turning them into booming centers of trade and military power. They were colonizers who brought their wives, their children, and their cattle. They were replacing the local population. To see the true genius of the Danish military mind, you have to look at the Trelleborg fortresses back in Denmark. These are perfectly circular forts, divided into 4 equal quadrants, with precise geometric barracks. They were built in the late 10th century, likely by King Harald Bluetooth. When you look at them from the air, they look like something aliens would build. They prove that the Danes were not barbarians. They were engineers. They had a grasp of mathematics and logistics that rivaled the Romans. These forts allowed the king to mobilize thousands of men in a matter of days, supply them, and launch them toward England. This professionalization of violence culminated in the 2 greatest Danish kings, Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute the Great. By the year 1000, the Danes had stopped being Vikings in the traditional sense. They had become a professional state army. Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England not to raid, but to overthrow the king, and he succeeded. In 1013, a Danish Viking became the king of England. His son, Canute, took it even further. Canute is perhaps the most underrated figure in medieval history. He created the North Sea Empire. He sat on the throne of England, the throne of Denmark, and the throne of Norway simultaneously. He commanded the resources of 3 nations. Under Canute, the Viking Age peaked. The Danes were no longer the outsiders banging on the gates of civilization. They were the civilization. Canute's personal guard, the Thingmen, were the most feared unit in Europe, men paid in pure silver, clad in the heaviest mail, wielding massive two-handed axes that could cleave a horse's neck. So were the Danes the deadliest. If you measured deadliness by the ability to destroy governments, to erase borders, and to subjugate entire populations, then the answer is an overwhelming yes. The Norwegians conquered islands, the Swedes conquered markets, but the Danes conquered kingdoms. They forced the map of Europe to be redrawn in their image. They forced the English to unite just to survive them. Without the Danish threat, there would be no England as we know it today. But there is a dark side to this efficiency. The Danes became so good at war, so organized, and so wealthy, that they eventually became the very thing they hated. They became a feudal state. They became European monarchs. The wild, chaotic spirit of the Viking Age died in Denmark first, suffocated by its own success. However, while the Danes were busy polishing their crowns and counting their English taxes, there was a land to the northeast that remained wild. A land that even the combined might of the Danish war machine hesitated to touch. A land where the compass spun wildly and the forests whispered in a language no Norseman could understand. It is time to talk about the people who were not Vikings, but who terrified them nonetheless. It is time to talk about Finland. We have established that the geography of Scandinavia created 3 distinct species of predator. But these differences were not just about how they fought or where they sailed. They went much deeper. The most profound split between the Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes was in how they viewed the very nature of power, freedom, and the gods themselves. To understand this cultural chasm, we have to look at 2 specific monuments. One is a massive stone in Denmark. The other is a field of dried lava in Iceland. In Denmark stands the Jelling Stone. It is often called Denmark's birth certificate. It was raised by King Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century. Carved into the granite, in runes large enough to be seen from a distance, is a boast. King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father. That Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This stone represents the Danish soul of the Viking Age. Centralization, authority, power concentrated in the hands of one man. The Danes were the first to embrace the concept of the European state. They liked hierarchy. They liked armies. They liked the idea that one strong man should rule everyone else down. Compare that to the Althing in Iceland, the colony founded by Norwegian rebels. The Althing was not a palace. It was a parliament held in an open rift valley called Thingvellir, where the tectonic plates of America and Europe pull apart. Every summer, the chieftains of Iceland would ride across the glaciers and lava fields to meet there. There was no king. There was no supreme ruler. Instead, there was the Elgieskeskamor, a man whose only job was to memorize the law and recite it to the people standing on the rocks. The Norwegians and their descendants believed in the Odelsrett, the ancient right of the free farmer. They believed that a man's land was his own kingdom. To a Norwegian Viking, the Danish model of a powerful king looked like slavery. To a Danish Viking, the Norwegian model of independent chieftains looked like chaos. This friction created a civil war of ideologies that tore the Viking world apart. And it wasn't just about politics. It was about religion. We tend to think all Vikings worshipped the same gods in the same way. This is false. The Danes, with their kings and armies, favored Odin. Odin was the Allfather, yes, but he was specifically the god of kings, of war, and of poetry. He was an aristocrat. He demanded human sacrifice by hanging as Ragnar did in Paris. He was the patron of the elite. The Swedes, however, had a deep connection to Freya, also known as Yngvi. Freya was the god of fertility, of peace, and of the harvest. This makes perfect sense for the Swedes, who relied on the stability of trade and the wealth of the land. The great temple at Uppsala in Sweden was the center of this fertility cult, involving rituals that shocked Christian observers with their sexual nature and the sacrifice of male animals. The Norwegians and Icelanders, they loved Thor, while Odin was a distant, tricky, aristocratic god. Thor was the working man's god. He was the protector. He held the hammer that smashed the giants, the forces of nature. For a Norwegian sailor battling a storm in the North Atlantic, or a farmer trying to grow crops on a granite cliff, Thor was the god you needed. Archaeological finds confirm this. In Iceland, Thor's hammer, amulets, Mjolnir, are everywhere. In Denmark, they are less common. These differences simmered for centuries until they finally exploded in the most dramatic naval battle of the Viking Age, the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000. This battle is the ultimate case study of Norway versus Sweden versus Denmark. It wasn't a raid on England. It was a showdown to decide who owned the north. On one side was Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway. He was the archetype of the Norwegian hero, tall, impossibly strong, reckless, and fighting on the most famous ship ever built, the Long Serpent, Ormen Lange. On the other side was a coalition of his enemies, Svein Forkbard, King of Denmark, and Olaf, Skatekoning, King of Sweden, along with a Norwegian traitor, Erik Jarl. The battle took place in the Baltic Sea. The Danish and Swedish fleets lay in ambush behind an island. As the Norwegian fleet sailed past, the trap was sprung. The sagas describe the scene in cinematic detail. King Olaf stood on the high deck of the Long Serpent, his shield blazing in the sun. He watched as the Danish ships attacked first. He dismissed them with contempt, saying, "I do not fear these cowards. There is no courage in the Danes." Then the Swedish ships attacked. Olaf laughed, saying, "The Swedes would be better off at home licking their sacrificial bowls than attacking the Long Serpent." But then he saw the ships of Erik Jarl, Norwegians, fighting for the enemy. And Olaf stopped laughing. He said, "These men we must fear, for they are Norwegians like us, and they fight with the same iron." The battle was a massacre. The Long Serpent was surrounded. The Danish and Swedish fleets grappled it with iron hooks, turning the sea battle into a land battle on the decks of the ships. For hours, the sound of axes on shields deafened the seabirds. The Swedes and Danes used their numbers. The Norwegians used their individual ferocity, but numbers won. As his men fell around him, King Olaf Tryggvason realized the battle was lost. He refused to be captured. In a final act of defiance, he threw his shield over his head and jumped into the sea, sinking beneath the waves in his heavy armor. The Battle of Svolder was the turning point. The Danes and Swedes won. They carved up Norway between them. This victory proved that the Danish model organization, alliances, and state power was superior to the Norwegian model of individual heroism. The age of the lonely seabolf was ending. The age of the armies had begun, but there was one force that would eventually conquer them all. A force that didn't come with a sword, but with a book. The cultural differences between the three nations were about to be erased by the greatest. disruptor in European history, Christianity. However, each nation would react to the White Christ in a very different way, and the way they converted would seal their fate as distinct nations forever. Asterisk, the Viking Age did not end with a whisper. It did not fade away because the Northmen suddenly decided to become peaceful farmers. It ended because the very engine that drove it, the pagan soul, was dismantled, piece by piece, and replaced by a new operating system. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia is the final, decisive chapter in our comparison, because it perfectly highlights the differences between the three nations. They didn't just convert. They converted in ways that mirrored their national characters. Denmark, the land of kings and politicians, converted first, and they did it for the most pragmatic reason of all: survival. By the mid-10th century, the Holy Roman Empire to the south was expanding. Otto the Great, the German emperor, was eyeing the north with a crusade in mind. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was a genius strategist. He realized that if he remained a pagan, the Germans would have a divine excuse to invade his land, kill his people, and steal his throne. But if he became a Christian, then he was a brother king. He was untouchable by a holy war. So Harald Bluetooth converted. But it wasn't a spiritual awakening. It was a political maneuver. He famously claimed on the gelling stone that he made the Danes Christian. Notice the phrasing. He didn't ask them, he ordered them. It was a top-down, state-mandated conversion. Because the Danish state was so organized, the transition was relatively smooth. The church became an arm of the king's power, helping him collect taxes and administer the land. Denmark stepped out of the Viking Age and into the Middle Ages with a handshake. Norway was a different story entirely. If Denmark's conversion was a treaty, Norway's conversion was a bloodbath. Remember the Norwegian character: independent, rebellious, and fierce. They were not going to give up Thor's hammer just because a king told them to. The conversion of Norway required a level of violence that borders on the psychopathic. It was driven by two kings, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf. These men were Vikings who had traveled abroad, seen the power of the Christian God in England and France, and returned home with a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other. Their message to the pagan chieftains was simple: be baptized or die, and they meant it. The sagas are filled with horror stories of how they enforced the faith. Olaf Tryggvason famously tortured those who refused to convert. In one instance, he forced a snake down the throat of a pagan chieftain, burning his insides. He placed hot coals on the bellies of others. He blinded them. He burned their farms. The resistance was fierce. The farmers of Trøndelag and the interior fought back for decades. It was a civil war between the old gods and the new. In the end, Christianity won, but only after breaking the back of the independent Norwegian aristocracy. Saint Olaf died in the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, cut down by his own pagan people. But his death became a martyrdom that finally sealed Norway's fate. And then there was Sweden. As always, Sweden was the outlier. While Denmark was building cathedrals and Norway was burning heretics, Sweden simply closed the door. The Swedes were the most stubborn of the three. Their conversion was a slow, creeping fog that took centuries. Why? Because Sweden was isolated. The German armies couldn't reach them easily. The Norwegian kings couldn't conquer them. And deep in the forests of Uppland stood the temple at Uppsala. This was the Vatican of the North. It was the heart of paganism. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler, wrote in terror about the golden temple where statues of Thor, Odin, and Freya sat on thrones, and where the blood of sacrificed animals and men dripped from the trees in the sacred grove. The Swedish kings were weak compared to the Danish kings. They couldn't force their people to convert. For a long time, Sweden existed in a strange twilight state. A king might be Christian, but his people were pagan. They would perform a blotting sacrifice to the old gods one day and trade with Christians the next. The temple at Uppsala wasn't destroyed until the late 11th century, nearly 100 years after Denmark had converted. The Swedes held onto the old ways until the very bitter end. But the end did come. The turning point, the official tombstone of the Viking ages, universally agreed to be the year 1066. And fittingly, it involved all the players we have discussed. The death of the English king, Edward the Confessor, triggered a chaotic scramble for the throne. And who came to claim it? Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. Hardrada was the last Viking. He was a throwback. He was 6'6", a former commander of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, a man who had fought in Sicily, Bulgaria, and Jerusalem. He invaded England not to settle, but to conquer. He brought with him the full might of the Norwegian war machine. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age died. Hardrada faced the English king Harold Godwinson. The battle was brutal. The Norwegians were caught off guard, without their armor. Hardrada fought like a demon, hacking his way through the English lines with his two-handed axe, entering a berserker rage, but an arrow struck him in the throat. The giant fell. The Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that sailed to England, only 24 returned to Norway. It was a catastrophe that broke the back of Norwegian military power forever. Weeks later, William the Conqueror landed. William was a Norman. Norman comes from Northman. He was the great-great-grandson of Rollo, a Viking who had settled in France. William conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. So, in a strange twist of irony, the Vikings did conquer England in 1066, but they were French-speaking, wind-drinking Vikings who had forgotten Odin and learned how to build stone castles. The era was over. The Danish kings became European monarchs, obsessed with taxes and borders. The Norwegian kings stopped sailing into the unknown and started fighting each other in petty squabbles. The Swedish kings turned their backs on the West entirely, focusing on a crusade into Finland, finally conquering the wizards, and expanding into the Baltic. The longships were pulled ashore and left to rot. The great halls fell silent. The axes were melted down into plowshares. The Northmen ceased to exist. Now there were only Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians. But the question remains, when the smoke cleared, when the last ship sailed, and when the history books were written, who actually won? Who was the deadliest? Who was the most successful? We have one final chapter to write. The verdict, asterisk, we have traveled through 3 centuries of blood, iron, and ice. We have stood on the granite cliffs of Norway, walked the flat killing fields of Denmark, and navigated the dark, endless rivers of Russia with the Swedes. We have seen how the geography of the North created 3 distinct species of predator, each adapted to hunt in a different way. But now, the history books are closed. The ships are burned. The gods are dead, and we are left with the question that started this journey. Who was the deadliest? Who was the greatest? To answer this, we must define what we mean by greatness. If greatness is measured by wealth, then the winner is Sweden. The Swedish Vikings were the silent giants of the age. while the Danes and Norwegians were fighting over muddy patches of land in England, the Swedes were tapping into the veins of the global economy. They realized that trade was more powerful than war. They built the longest trade routes in history, connecting the Arctic Circle to the Silk Road. They founded the state of Russia, a legacy that has outlasted every other Viking kingdom. They served in the throne room of the Caesars in Constantinople. The massive hoards of Islamic silver found in Swedish soil tell the story. They were the richest, the most disciplined, and perhaps the smartest of them all. If greatness is measured by spirit and exploration, then the winner is Norway. The Norwegians were the romantic heroes of the Viking Age. They were the ones who refused to be caged. They looked at the terrifying, grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a barrier that had stopped every other civilization in history, and they saw a highway. They discovered Iceland. They settled Greenland. They walked on the shores of North America 500 years before Columbus. They achieved the impossible not because they had armies, but because they had an indomitable will. They were the deadliest sailors the world has ever seen. Men who would rather drown as free men than live as servants. But, if greatness is measured by military power and conquest, then there is only one answer. The winner is Denmark. The Danes were the true kings of war. They were the only ones who managed to turn the chaotic violence of the Viking Age into a professional military machine. They didn't just raid, they conquered. They toppled the ancient kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. They besieged Paris. They carved out the Danelaw. They built the Trelleborg fortresses, engineering marvels that proved they were not savages, but masters of logistics. Under Canute the Great, they achieved what no other Viking nation could. They united the North Sea into a single empire. For a brief moment, the King of Denmark was the most powerful man in Europe. They were the deadliest because they understood that an army is stronger than a warrior, and a state is stronger than a clan. And what of Finland, the land of wizards? They win a different kind of victory. They won the victory of survival. They remained the other. They held their borders against the most aggressive expansionist force in history. They kept their language, their culture, and their mystery intact. They proved that sometimes the best defense is to be the forest that no one dares to enter. Asterisk, the Viking Age is over, but its echoes are still with us. You can hear it in the English language, where words like sky, knife, law, and window come straight from Old Norse. You can see it in the map of Europe, shaped by the pressure of the Northmen. You can feel it in the DNA of millions of people around the world. We tend to look back at them as monsters. We call them barbarians. We judge them for the blood eagles, the slavery, and the burning of monasteries. But we also envy them. We envy their freedom. We envy their absolute lack of fear. We envy the clarity of a life where your destiny is determined by the strength of your arm and the courage in your heart. They were three nations, forged by three different landscapes, fighting three different wars. The Norwegian was the wolf, lonely and fierce, hunting the wild edges of the world. The Swede was the bear, strong and enduring, guarding the wealth of the East. The Dane was the boar, aggressive and organized, charging headfirst into the heart of civilization. Together, they were the Vikings, and for 300 years, they made the world hold its breath.